Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
So let's get into our true crime case for the day.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, and your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it.
Today we're delving into the tragic story of Botham Jean, a young man whose life was cut short in a shocking incident that sparked nationwide discussions about police conduct, racial bias, and the pursuit of justice. Botham Jean was born and raised in St. Lucia, a small island nation in the Caribbean. He was the middle child of Allison and Botham Jean, with siblings born 10 years apart on either side of him. Wow. So essentially his sister was 10 years older than him and his little brother was 10 years younger than him.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's like being an only child, I feel like. You kind of get, like, you're a middle child, but not a true middle child in the sense of the word, right? Like, you kind of are, all of them were kind of like only children.
Yeah, and maybe that was intentional. We don't know. But I just think it's perfect timing that Allison and Bertram did that. And his parents described him as the glue that held the family together, particularly his siblings, acting as a bridge in their relationship. From an early age, Botham showed exceptional promise. He was a bright student with a deep commitment to his faith. In his church in St. Lucia, he became a song leader, demonstrating his musical talents and leadership abilities. After graduating high school, Botham's ambitions led him to the United States to further his education. He chose Harding University in Searcy, which is in Arkansas, where he quickly made an impression. Those who knew him described Botham as a natural-born leader with an infectious personality that drew others to him. His charisma and intelligence were evident to all who met him. After college, Botham's career was off to a promising start. In 2018, he was working as an accountant at PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the largest accounting firms in the world. However, despite his success in the corporate world, Botham had grander aspirations. His long-term goal was to gain experience as an accountant, but ultimately he dreamed of returning to St. Lucia to become the prime minister. Botham's commitment to helping others was a constant throughout his life. For consecutive years, he returned to St. Lucia to work with students, building homes for senior citizens. His desire to make a positive impact on people's lives was evident in everything he did.
But on September 6, 2018, Botham's life took an unexpected and tragic turn. That evening, he called his sister to share some everyday news. He had recently had his wisdom teeth removed and was excited about being able to eat some ice cream again. He told her he planned to watch TV and enjoy some ice cream that night. It was a normal, mundane conversation between siblings, but it would be their last. At 9:56 p.m. on September 6, a 911 dispatcher in Dallas received a panicked call from a woman requesting both EMS and police. The caller confirmed that someone had been shot. The location of the call was just 500 feet from a Dallas Police Department station. Alyssa got a call from a hospital social worker in Dallas early the next morning of September 7th, informing her that Botham had been shot and had died in the hospital. Alyssa, who was in Brooklyn with their mother at the time, had to break the unimaginable news to her. As the family grappled with their grief, they were left with more questions than answers. The initial reports were vague, only stating that Botham had been shot by a police officer. The lack of information and the circumstances surrounding the shooting left the family and the public demanding answers and justice. The incident sparked protests in Dallas and across the nation. It raised critical questions about police accountability, racial bias, and honestly, the safety of Black individuals, even in their own homes. The case gained national attention, becoming a vocal point in ongoing discussions about the police's use of force and systematic racism within law enforcement. Now, back in Dallas, police were holding off details of Botham's murder. Now, this is not unusual with any kind of homicide. Police are not going to immediately release information to the public because they need to gather evidence and gather the facts of the case before they do that. But nevertheless, they did put protocols DPD had in place for the department. They had the officer placed on administrative leave. Botham's best friend was informed of his death, and the one thing that is highlighted in this case is the astonishment from Botham's family and friends. It indeed warranted, as his death was, it was indeed warranted because his death was so unexpected, and it took everyone by surprise. Now, in this case, there was a ripple effect of death, and its waves could be felt for generations to come. Alyssa and Allison flew to Dallas to find out more about the details of Botham's murder. Alyssa, Botham's sister, spoke to the detective handling the case, and she asked if the person who shot Botham was placed under arrest. Now, the detective informed her that the police officer was placed on administrative leave and that the police officer had 72 hours to explain what happened before anything else in regards to the police officer would be done. Now, this was a huge blow for Allison, Botham's mom, because the person who was responsible for her son's death remained free, and she was forced to go forward with plans of burying her son without the person who was responsible in prison. Now, while planning for the funeral, she decided to get herself and her family representation.
Why did she decide to get representation? Is that something that we see? I mean, I know with this night, if we see it, we do see it often with families and victims of maybe police brutality. Why is that something that families do?
Well, it's to ensure that, the legal process is occurring correctly, but also, well, let me go back. So it is ensuring that the legal process is happening, right? I think a lot of times we don't, as just lay people who don't know the law, we think we know enough that we can interact with the police officer or interact with law enforcement, and we know what should be done and what should not be done, but we really don't. We don't know. And so it's, to ensure that, as an attorney, we know the law, we can ensure that the correct procedures, the correct steps are happening, and that we're pushing the case forward. We're just making sure that the prosecution is making this case a priority, right? But then the other part of it is to protect your civil rights, right? So you have criminal rights and then you have civil rights. And so this is really just a setup for a potential civil case later down the road that could potentially happen in terms of the family suing Dallas Police Department.
Perfect. So the family hired an attorney out of Dallas named Lee Merritt, and they finally did confirm that it was a white police officer who killed Botham and actually lived in the same apartment complex. Slowly, information was given to the family and the public. As detectives were untangling the sequence of events, it only left the family with more time to consider what happened. Ironically, Botham was observant and watched his surroundings for danger. He also kept good company and complied, and they didn't understand how did this tragedy happen, because as we know, there was information that was slowly leaking out about this case. So the chief of Dallas Police Department, Renee Hall, finally released a statement. She confirmed that it was a female white police officer who was off duty, who recently finished her shift and encountered Botham in his apartment, to which she thought it was actually her apartment that she was entering. At some point, the off-duty officer fired her weapon, killing Botham. The overall message to the Black community was this: we're not safe on the streets, but more importantly, we're not safe in our homes. And for just a quick second, MD, I want to talk about the nature of being killed in your home, right? We haven't really got into the meat of this case just yet, but we've seen crimes that have taken place inside of the home. What do you think about that?
your house, your home, your home, whether it's your apartment, it doesn't matter. Your home, where you live, where you lay your head, is sanctimount. And that, in the legal system, it is the place where law enforcement, where others are not allowed without your consent or without a warrant. Right? So even just think of a normal day. You go home, somebody wants to come to your house. They have to do what?
Ask.
They have to ask, they have to ring the doorbell, they have to knock on the door, and then you have to answer and either allow them in or not allow them in. And so for a crime to take place in your house, for you to be burglared, to be robbed, to be killed, to be, assaulted in your home is just of the utmost disrespect, right? Because if you are not safe in your house, where you can lock the doors, where you can ensure your safety, where are you safe?
Exactly. I mean, it's the ultimate violation. So protests began in Dallas and the U.S. throughout the Black community, and allies demanded that this cop be charged with murder. The question and theories about Botham's murder quickly started to emerge inside of the public as the investigation took place with the police department. So let's run through a couple of these questions that the public had. They said, did Botham actually have a relationship with this female officer, or just some type of connection with her since they lived in the same apartment building? Was it romantic? Nobody knew. They also wondered, how could she enter without a key? Did she knock? Was the door open? And then, more importantly, why did she feel like she had to use deadly force? In the preliminary investigation, they retrieved Botham's cell phone to see and analyze different factors and determine if he was indeed expecting someone that night. There were also reports that since she lived below him, and Botham would sing at his church in Dallas, because not only was he a leader in his St. Lucia church, he also was a leader in Dallas singing at his home church, West Dallas Church. And so he would often rise up early and sing. And so they felt like, is it probable that she got annoyed with his singing in the early mornings? There were actually some noise complaints, and they felt like it could have been her. Shortly after the investigation began, a recording was released of 2 shots and a woman in a police uniform pacing back and forth as emergency responders arrived. That video went viral. So the police couldn't keep quiet about the identification of the police officer involved. It was revealed that the officer who shot Botham was Amber Geyer. The theory was floating around social media with a picture attached to Botham amongst a group of girls, and they felt like maybe this was her because they had not released her picture just yet. People still were trying to fumble around with these theories. The public and the family wanted to hear Amber's story. They wanted to know her side of events. There was still a lot of unknown in this case, and the DPD tried to actually go in and save Botham's life. They performed CPR. They did all the emergency measures that you're supposed to do. But the question became, did Amber actually provide CPR and aid to Botham? According to Amber, she did. But as the ADA began to look at this situation and this murder, they felt like she did not. And they began to conduct an investigation, not just within who Botham was talking to on that day, but also they had to talk to police officers, review footage, and EMT providers on the night of the murder. However, when they looked at the footage from a police car, Geyer was put into the back or the front of a police car, and she's conversating with a police officer, and then suddenly the footage is turned off. The actual camera is turned off. And this presented a bigger question to the district attorney as he wondered, why was it turned off at all?
Now, on September 9, 2018, the DA announced after the initial investigation that that Amber Geiger was going to be arrested on manslaughter charges and was later released on bond.
So, MD, just quickly, can you explain manslaughter versus murder? I know we've talked about it, but just touch on it real quick.
So that's actually a good question, Steph. And I think it's important to understand that in Texas, we don't have, like in other states, you have involuntary manslaughter and you have voluntary manslaughter. But in Texas, we just have the term manslaughter. We combine like both of those. It doesn't matter if it's involuntary or voluntary, because really the requirement to prove manslaughter, for the prosecution to be able to prove manslaughter, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you acted recklessly to cause somebody else's death, right? So there is no intent or knowledge, requirement. You don't have to have knowledge that you were going to kill. You don't have to have intent to kill. The only requirement for manslaughter in Texas is to be reckless, right? So that's why if you kill someone in Texas while you're under the influence, while you're driving under the influence, you could go to jail for manslaughter if you were convicted, right? Whereas in the state of Texas, a conviction for murder is to intentionally, like the definition for murder in the state of Texas is to intentionally or knowingly cause the death of a person. So you see the difference is manslaughter doesn't require knowledge or intent, but in murder, you have to prove knowledge. You have to prove that you intentionally knew that you were causing someone's death. So those are the differences. Does that make sense?
Total sense. So what happened?
So they charge her with manslaughter, or they arrest her under the charge of manslaughter. She gets released on bond, and they continue to do their investigation. And on the body cam evidence, we see she's talking to police officers on the scene. And in this conversation she has with the police officers, she never states that she was in fear for her life, right? But later on, after, she gets arrested and she's recounting her story to the police, at that point, she says she was in fear of her life. She felt like Botham was coming toward her or at her, and she feared for her life in that moment. Now, that's important, right? The reason that that's important, especially in light of knowing what murder and manslaughter is that if she was in fear of her life, it provides an affirmative defense to the manslaughter charge. Now, the question becomes, did law enforcement help her develop this story for her defense, right? Like, did they help her develop the story? Is that where, when they turn off that camera footage, is that what was happening? We don't know. So police officers decided that they were going to review the footage from outside of the apartment complex. Now, Mike Mata was the president of the Dallas Police Officer Association, and he was the one who instructed the officers to shut off the cameras. DPD tried to help her. It appeared that DPD was trying to help her cover up this crime. At least that's how the public and the family perceived it. And if you're sitting there listening to this story, that's how it looks. Why would he instruct the police department or why would he instruct his officers to turn off the camera? That just doesn't make sense. What are your thoughts, Steph?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look good, right? Like you never want to be put in a situation, guilty by association. It doesn't look good. And I think we live in a time where cops having, it's so interesting. This is sidebar. But I've been watching a lot of cops pulling people over on TikTok. It's like my favorite pastime now. And so you see people immediately say, because of the police brutality that many minorities experience, they're like, I'm about to record this. And the police like, I'm recording it. And by police recording it, it provides an account of what actually is going on in real time. And so for them to cut that off, and then for her to be charged with the manslaughter crime, and then she has this defense where she once says, in the moment, live, I thought I was in the wrong apartment. She never says anything about fearing for her life. You would think one would say that in that moment, but she doesn't. But then she doubles back and says it. It just seems suspicious.
It does. And I think what my mom or our mom always says really is applicable here. Police have their own fraternity, right? And they're going to stick together regardless of the circumstance. This is known by the public, which is why in this situation, it wasn't hard to believe that the camera was turned off so that they could protect their own. Botham was funeralized on September 13, 2018. His funeral was attended by hundreds. Let me just make sure I'm clear. It's tons of people attended this funeral. His presence and legacy left an imprint on the hearts of all he touched and people he didn't even touch, people that only came to know him after. And I say that because I was one of those people, especially his community in Dallas. The same day he was funeralized, the Dallas Police Department conducted a search warrant on Botham Jean's apartment, and they found a small bag of marijuana. It was roughly about 10.4 grams, and a marijuana grinder in his apartment. The media, you already know, used this information to villainize Botham. It was a smear campaign against Botham, which is completely ridiculous and unfair considering the fact that he was the victim.
Absolutely. I hate when they do that. The effects on Botham's family were devastating, as you can imagine. His brother Brant became angry, and this is his younger brother. He began punching and hitting walls. When Brant was 16 and his brother was 26, he visited Botham in Dallas. However, they didn't immediately hit it off as Botham planned. Brent spent a lot of time playing video games, being a teenager, and it just made it challenging to actually spend time with him, according to Alyssa, their older sister. She recounted a time where Botham, while Brent was visiting, called her, and he actually cried on the phone because he didn't know how to get his brother to spend time with him and to be open so they could really and truly build their relationship. So Alyssa, being the best big sister, told him, just take him out, do things that teens like to do. And so they found themselves at Six Flags, and really that opened the door for them to build on their relationship. So they were developing a close relationship when Botham was murdered. Brant felt the residual effects of grief because they were actually building a relationship when his brother died. And his family began to notice that he was playing Call of Duty, which is a shooting game. He was playing that constantly, and it seemed like he was out for revenge. And at one point, he even stated that he wanted Amber to die. Now, the Texas law requires that felony charges are brought before a grand jury. So the grand jury would decide if the charges against Amber would be upgraded, dropped, or would remain what the DA initially charged her with. After hearing all of the evidence, the grand jury did charge her with murder. His family and the public were pleased as they held a lot of protests during the time that the investigation was taking place. Now, DPD didn't release the 911 call. However, WFAA, a local news station here in Dallas, obtained the audio. I'll play the audio for you guys now. It's 5 minutes long.
Number.
Do you need police as well or just EMS?
Yes, I need both.
Okay, what's the address?
1478. I'm in 1478.
And what's the address there?
It's 1210 South Lamar. 1478. Yes.
What's going on?
I'm an off-duty officer. I thought it was in my apartment, and I shot a guy thinking it was my apartment.
You shot someone?
Yes, I thought it was my apartment. I'm fucked.
Okay, and where are you at right now?
I'm in. What do you mean? I'm inside the apartment with him. Hey, come on.
What's your name?
I'm Amber Geiger. I need to get me. I'm in. Hey, man.
Okay, stay with me, okay?
I am. I'm a need supervisor. Hey, bud. Hey, bud. Hey, bud.
we have help on the way? Please. They're on their way.
I just want to park on the third floor.
Okay, I understand.
No.
What ticket did in there?
No. He's like, they're coming. They're like, I'm sorry, man.
Okay, where was he shot?
He's on the top left.
Okay, you're with Dallas PD, right?
Yes, me too.
They're trying to get you.
It's my apartment. I thought it was my apartment.
In the audio, you hear how remorseful Amber seems, and she keeps recounting that she entered the wrong apartment. However, a lot of people heard that audio and they felt a lot of remorse for her and felt like she was remorseful. And this really did seem like an accident. However, after Botham's mother heard the audio, she said she didn't hear a repentant person. She said that Amber seemed selfish and more concerned about herself than Botham. Naturally, the public and the DA began to probe Amber's social media. However, when they looked, most of her social media was scrubbed clean, but she forgot her Pinterest. There was a meme that said, "I got a gun, shovel, and guns. If I were you, I'd back the F up and get off my ass." Another meme said, "Waiting on Obama to come to a cop's funeral like," and there's a skeleton sitting on the chair, implying that Obama would never show up for a cop's funeral. The prosecution didn't seem confident going into trial, and they told the family that there was a plea deal on the table. This was a low point for the family as they wanted justice for Botham. However, they knew it was going to be hard to get a conviction from a cop. There was a lot of factors at play. I mean, white privilege, the fact that she's a white woman, it was a lot of racial implications inside of this case. So the DA had to prove that Amber intentionally or knowingly caused the death of Botham Jean. They had to disprove whatever justification the defense would offer.
So the trial began in 2019, and some of the theories that Steph talked about before, like how did Amber get in? Like why, like what happened, was addressed during trial. And it's important to know that the apartment complex that Amber and Botham lived in, they recently got their locks changed. So if the front door of the apartment complex was not appropriately closed or wasn't completely pulled all the way, then the lock wouldn't fully engage. And I want to just stop right here because I want to make sure you guys know the type of apartment complex we're dealing with. This is not an outside apartment complex where you're having to walk up outside of some stairs. This apartment complex is inside. The best way that I like to think of it is like a New York style apartment complex. You're inside of a building. And so the locks were, and they had multiple witnesses, like take the stands, who lived in the apartment complex that talked about how if the door wasn't fully closed, the lock would not fully engage. The weather also affected the locks at the apartment complex. So if it was super hot outside or humid or very cold. So all of these things played a factor. And according to Amber's testimony, she was able to actually just push the door open. So she didn't have to use a key or anything to open the door. The door was open. And upon entering, she encountered Botham, who approached her in an aggressive way, which didn't match the evidence that investigators found. The DA made it clear that she was presented with choices during that time, and the DA presented that. And so what the choices that the DA was describing here, she was able to present these choices through witness testimony, right? So by bringing up officers and asking them, if you were in a similar situation, what does your training provide for you to do, right? So when she entered into the apartment complex or into the apartment and saw Botham Jean approaching her aggressively, the DA made it seem like, okay, Amber could have at that point backed out of the apartment, could have called for help, could have, there were other things she could have done other than pulling her firearm and shooting. And it was proven through the evidence that Botham was, in fact, not even coming at her. He fell in a football position, implying he was trying to get off the couch. So he was standing up off of his couch, not moving toward her. The bullet went through his chest, but landed in his back, which is an unusual placement. Steph, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it really points to how the bullet entered him upon standing up. And if he was coming at her, it would not have landed in his back like that. So it confirms that he wasn't coming at her, or else the bullet would have landed differently.
Right, so the bullet trajectory conflicted with her account. And everything aligned with the evidence that he was sitting down, watching TV, and eating a bowl of ice cream, just like he told his sister he was planning to do that night. The defense tried to hammer in that she thought she was in her apartment and therefore had the right to defend herself. And I want to pause here too, because I watched this trial in real time with, my law professors and, fellow law attorneys. And it was very riveting to get this testimony, because I think when you just hear this on paper, or you hear me and Steph say that she thought she was in the wrong apartment, I think you sit back and say, how? How can you think you are in the wrong apartment? That just simply does not make sense. And I know that's how I thought as the prosecution presented their testimony. But when you had the defense stand up and the defense brought in their witnesses, and they had multiple witnesses, or even when they cross-examined the prosecution's witnesses, they brought up the fact that this apartment complex was not well distinguishable, that there were multiple accounts of people walking in to somebody else's apartment complex where they accidentally almost entered the wrong apartment complex. And when you're driving up the parking lot, how it looks the same. Like, you know how usually different levels is like different colors sometimes, or it's distinguishable that I'm on level 1 and level 2 and level 3. And it wasn't like that here. And they really were able to show through the evidence, through pictures and through witness testimony, that it is very probable and possible that Amber thought that she was entering into her apartment and she wasn't. Now, when she gave her testimony, because she did in fact testify, which was also very alarming in this case, as an attorney, we highly discourage you from testifying unless it is really the only option, right? But you, as the person that is on trial, you get that right. We don't get to tell you what to do. You have the right to testify, and you have the right to remain silent. And your silence cannot be used against you, right? That's not just in your Miranda rights that are given to you when you're in a police station, but that also extends to you when you're on trial in a courtroom, that your silence cannot be used against you. So to hone in on that a little bit more, is the prosecution cannot say, you see, they didn't even testify. They didn't even stand up and try to tell you that they were innocent. They cannot say that. If they do, the trial is, it's a mistrial and you have to start all over. So when she did give up and give her testimony, the jury cried, she cried, the jury cried, and she told her version of events. And this was another strike to the family and to the DA, because here she is getting sympathy from the jury. I remember watching this thinking, wow, like, she all she had to do was shed some tears, and now the jury sways her way. Right. And I can only imagine that's probably how her family felt, that it wasn't going to be an easy conviction. It wasn't going to be, this was not a slam dunk case. It wasn't a black and white, type of a case. You didn't know which way it was going to be swayed. And her defense painted her as being an innocent angel. They brought up character character witnesses that, talked about, the things that Amber did in the community and how amazing she was as a person. But the DA also came with their guns blazing too. And it was discovered at trial that Amber had an affair with a married police officer at the DPD. And that affair lasted 2 years and was off and on. And according to phone records, her and this officer had plans to meet up for sex on the night of Botham's murder. And Amber testified that she was driving fast while she was on the phone with Martin, trying to finalize her plans and, hurry up and get to him and go do what she was trying to do, that she missed the floor of her apartment. So if you remember, I said these floors looked similar. It was hard to distinguish them. And if you're in a rush and you're trying to hurry up and get to your booty call, maybe you can miss that you're not on the right floor. And she became upset that, they weren't going to meet that night because, Martin, decided to cancel the plans at the last minute. And so now she's angry. She was rushing, but now she's angry. And she's angry because Martin ditched her at the last minute. And so the prosecution really painted this picture that Amber was, fueled up on anger against not being able to see Martin, that when she saw Botham in what she believed was her apartment, she took out her anger on Botham and she fatally shot him, and fully knowing that the Dallas Police Department was 500 feet away from her apartment building. So if she was in that much fear, the prosecution argued, if you were in that much fear for your life, why couldn't you back up and wait for DPD to provide backup for you? And there are so many other options than shooting Botham fatally, right? Like, even if you felt like you had to fire your gun, do you fire it at him or do you fire it in his chest? And this was the picture that the DA laid out for the jury. Now, Amber's side is that she acted as a police officer. She yelled out commands for Botham to follow. He didn't follow them. She claimed that he was not compliant with her commands. And this also became another thorn in Botham's family side, as they said she was aware of what it was to be a black man in this country. You have to be compliant to not just the police, but anybody, because how was he supposed to know she was the police? But I digress. According to the DA, they thought she was self-centered and portrayed herself as a victim. Now, after the shooting, Amber texted Martin. Like, this is what she does. I mean, she's on the phone with, we heard the 911 call, but shortly after that, she texts, the guy that she's having this affair with, and they both erased a lot of messages before their records were subpoenaed. Okay, so it's almost like she begins to go in cleanup mode. Now, what they were able to find about the affair between Amber and this officer is she does say, I effed up. She was sending and receiving messages throughout the time of the shooting and after the shooting. She wasn't helping, they argued she wasn't helping save Botham's life. She wasn't giving CPR. And at 10:05 p.m., police footage shows her walking around and texting. She wasn't crying. She wasn't showing any kind of emotion. She was talking about getting drunk in the days after the murder and having sexual encounters with this same officer. She felt confident that she would get away with this shooting. And after 7 days, the prosecution rested, and the judge informed the jury of what they were to deliberate on. Now, the judge in this case allowed the Castle Doctrine to come into trial. Now, you may be sitting there wondering, what is the Castle Doctrine? And this is actually a very big issue in this case. And at the beginning of trials, they have what is called motions in limine. And motions in limine are what you're trying to get excluded from the trial. So if there is some sort of evidence that you do not want to come in during the trial that was discovered during the discovery process of the case, you get an opportunity, both sides get an opportunity to argue their motions in limine. And one of the motions that the DA was trying to exclude was the castle doctrine. And the defense wanted this doctrine to come in because it was arguably the only defense that Amber Geyer had a leg to stand on. So perhaps the easiest way to understand the castle doctrine is to think of it in terms of a king and a queen. A king and a queen has no duty to retreat inside their own castle. And if someone unlawfully comes into their castle, the king and the queen can use any force available to resist that attack. So the castle doctrine in Texas, based on the Texas Penal Code, allows individuals to use force, including deadly force, to protect themselves, others, or their property without a duty to retreat. And it's important to understand a couple of key provisions that the judge is going to look at, or the jury is going to look at, in order to determine whether or not the castle doctrine is applicable. So this includes justifiable use of force. If one reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent unlawful force by an intruder, right? And then a justifiable use of deadly force if one reasonably believes that it is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury, or a violent crime such as kidnapping, murder, sexual assault, or robbery. And then, of course, there's no duty to retreat if the individual is lawfully presented with to not engage in criminal activity. The doctrine does not apply if the person using the force is the initial aggressor, is provokes the attack, or is engaged in criminal activity. So, to summarize all of that, in other words, in a very short, concise way, you can use the castle doctrine if you believe that you have an imminent threat of bodily danger coming towards you while you are in your home, right? Because we've already stated that the home is your sanctuary. And so you do not have a duty to retreat your home if somebody unlawfully enters your home. Now, the DA in this case is saying, how in the world can Amber Geyer use the castle doctrine in this case when this was not her home? This is not her house. And so this was a huge argument, right, that the DA was trying to argue, because they're saying she can't use it because she doesn't even meet the elements that are required to use the castle doctrine. She wasn't in her house. She did not have imminent threat upon her, and she did, so therefore she does not have the ability to say she can't retreat. Well, the defense is saying, hey, creatively, they're saying, no. She believed that she was in her house. And so based upon the belief that she was in her house, and according to her testimony, Botham was engaging her in an aggressive way, and she felt in fear of her life, then she does not have a duty to retreat. Now, this could be argued for days, and I'm telling you, I know it could be argued for days because we argued it for days amongst our, my law professors and, my peers. And we could go all day long, but I'm not going to go there, because what we know is that the judge in this case did allow the castle doctrine to be used for Amber Geyer's defense. And so that was a blow to the prosecution. And so that was something. So that was something that the jury was allowed to consider. So even if they came to the consensus that yes, Amber killed, which was not ever up for debate, but Amber killed Botham Jean. Did she do that? The question then becomes, did she do that justifiably? Was she justifiable in her reasons for killing him? Now, as the family and the public waited, and it felt like forever as the jury deliberated, Alyssa described this feeling of weight as being underwater. And I can only imagine, because you don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to, get the justice that we deserve? And finally, the jury came back, and the family entered the courtroom. Decorated DPD officers were lined up on each side of the courtroom, and then the jury returned their verdict. And they determined that Amber Guyger was, in fact, guilty of murder. The family was in awe, and the first person they praised was God. It was an audible gasp in the courtroom. And although they experienced an incredible loss, it felt like victory had arrived. But for the people in his family, they were filled with immense sadness as they felt the sting of the loss of Botham Jean.
That afternoon, the punishment phase commenced. Amber and Botham's family were inside the courtroom giving their accounts before she was sentenced. They handed down a sentence of 10 years. It felt like a slap in the face to the family. They expected that she would get anywhere between 30 to 40 years. After all, she took a life. People outside the courtroom began to protest. It was an unfair sentencing. Jean's family was allowed to read impact statements. Brent didn't want to, but his grandmother asked him if he would, and so he conceded. Many family members feared what he would say because of his acts of violence that he had done leading up to the trial and just his insistence on revenge. However, Brent was calm when presenting his statement. He told Amber directly to go to God and he would forgive her if she was contrite. He also said he loved her and forgave her. He said that if it were up to him, he wouldn't send her to jail, but he would tell her to go on her way and live a better life. That's what Botham would have wanted. Do better for yourself. Knowing it was unconventional, he asked the judge twice if he could hug her. Finally, the judge did allow it. They embraced, and he described Amber's face as if she had just seen a miracle take place. Everyone in the courtroom was shocked. Alyssa, Botham's older sister, was just trying to process everything she was seeing. She had to process the fact that, one, she just got convicted. Amber was just convicted of murder. Two, she was charged with sentenced to just 10 years. And now her younger brother was on the stand giving his account of forgiveness and actually stepping down to hug the woman that murdered her brother. And she couldn't figure out how she felt. She didn't know how to process any of it. She felt and asked herself, how did Botham feel? How would Botham feel with everything that just took place? And she determined that she didn't know. Everyone was in awe at the act of kindness that Brent showed to Amber. And this did not just end with the people inside of the courtroom. This was noticeable throughout social media. In fact, there was a lot of talk on Black Twitter in particular about his choice to forgive Amber and actually give her a hug. MD, do you remember seeing all of the talk surrounding this?
Oh, it was yes. The answer is yes. I do remember it, and it was quite something to witness, to be honest. I watched it, and I remember feeling very similar to Alyssa, like excited that they received a guilty verdict, that the DA was able to prevail in their case. Then simultaneously saddened during the punishment phase of the crime, where she only received 10 years. And then moving, so like, I felt like there was just like this myriad of emotions that you go on, right? Like you're happy, then you're sad and maybe even angered that, she only got 10 years. Cause you're also thinking, what if this was a Black woman? What if this was a Black man? Like, would it be the same? You can't help but question it. And then to see Brent go up and hug her, it broke me. And so I thought, it broke, I literally cried. And because I was just like, I don't know if I could do that. I literally felt like, here I am a believer, I'm a Christian, and I believe in the power of forgiveness, and I believe that God has called us to forgive, and I don't know if I could do that. And it just broke me, and I thought that would be the consensus amongst my peers, amongst, people that I knew and didn't know. And I remember going on social media and seeing, oh no, people are livid that he forgave her.
Absolutely. And the family, at least Brant, became pariahs to the activist community that embraced the family just days before. However, the family and Brant remained resolute that he did what he needed to do, and they supported him. Now, Botham was taken back to St. Lucia to be buried in the cemetery with his family, and the cemetery is close to his father's job. He frequents Botham's plot often. And I want to make it known that Mike Mata, who was the president of the Dallas Police Officer Association, was indicted in 2020. However, the grand jury decided not to move forward with any charges. Amber did try to appeal, but the ruling was upheld in 2021.
Now, Botham Jean's tragic death sparked important conversations about racial injustice and police accountability. His life, though cut short, left an indelible mark on his community and beyond. In the wake of his death, several initiatives were created to honor his memory and continue his legacy of service, including the Botham Jean Foundation and a scholarship program established by Harding University and the PricewaterhouseCoopers 213.
While nothing can bring Botham back, his legacy lives on through the changes his case has inspired and the lives he's touched during his short but impactful life. As we reflect on Botham Jean's story, we're reminded of the ongoing need for justice, accountability, and the systemic change in our society. His life, cut short too soon, continues to inspire conversations and actions aimed at creating a more just and equitable world. So our question for the day is, if you were on the jury for the Amber Guyger trial, what factors would you have considered most crucial in determining her guilt or innocence, and why? So instead of a takeaway today, what we're going to do is ask each other that question. MD.
Well, I think for me, I'm going to consider what what was presented before me. I think the biggest factor when I watched this trial, Steph, that really made me determine that she should be guilty, because I think it was never a question. This is an unusual murder trial because it was never a question of whether or not she killed Botham. It was always a question of whether or not it was justifiable. And so because the castle doctrine is allowed in, whether you agree with that or not, you have to consider the factors of the castle doctrine. And I think it was, for me, I think that the prosecution did a really amazing job presenting their case, but I'm going to be very honest. The defense did a phenomenal job as well, because there were moments while I watched this trial where I really began to question whether or not it was reasonable to believe that she was in the wrong, in her apartment, and, seeing how often that took place, both documented in records with that apartment complex and with testimony from witnesses. It just really began to make you wonder, okay, what is right? What's wrong here? Was she justified or was she not? And I think what finally sealed it for me, and what I would have, what I would have considered if I were a juror, is the reason, because if you recall, the defense kept saying Amber was acting as a police officer. She was acting within her role of an officer. And so therefore we have to view all of her actions within that lens, right? That was one of their defenses. And the DA came up and they stated, well, looking at it as an officer, and they had a police officer on the trial, in the jury, that they were the witness. And they asked the officer, if you are in a position where you're in imminent danger, what is your training? What does your training require you to do? And that officer, and it was I want to say it was two different officers, and both officers stated that the training requires for them to back away, safely back away and call for backup. They asked them, if you were in this situation, you walked in and you saw someone sitting on your couch, what would you do as an officer? And they said, we would back out of the door of the apartment complex and call for backup. Because Amber did not do that, her training provided her to do that. Her training required her to do that, trained her to do that, and yet you as the defense is telling me that we're supposed to look at her as an officer, and she didn't act reasonably as an officer, then I have to say guilty as charged.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the jury had like a hard task, right? Like you're supposed to put your biases aside, and that would have been hard for me. I think they would have kicked me off.
Yeah, you probably would never have made it on the jury.
I wouldn't have made it.
Because they would have weeded you out.
I wouldn't have made it. So if you're like me, you could just type in, I wouldn't have made it. I wouldn't have been there. But I think MD gave a good account of how probably the jury saw it, and there's not, oftentimes they'll do like a sit down interview, like a 2020 or Dateline, where they sit down and they'll poll some jurors just to see what they were thinking during that time. I haven't seen anything like that out there, but it would be interesting just to know their thoughts and what they thought about the trial and what made them convict her ultimately. So that is our case. That is the case of Botham Jean. I want to give you guys an announcement before we leave. So we got a couple of house duties or clean house, whatever they say. So clarification on content. We want to assure you that we don't exclusively produce paid subscription content. I'm going to say that again. We don't exclusively produce paid subscription content. While we do offer a paid option, we will always maintain a free platform where you can enjoy our weekly episodes. We've received numerous questions about this, so we wanted to address it clearly. All right? So that was twice. Run it back if you forgot. Now, changes to our Spotify platform. If you didn't know, our host site is Spotify for podcasters. We love it. They're high-key paying us for saying that, but But they're making some adjustments on their home platform, and we will no longer be posting our questions. So I will ask you a question at the end of the episode, and you will see a poll at the end of the episode as well. But they have a comment section. So instead, we encourage you to respond to our question that we've posed for you guys on the episode, or you can just simply share your thoughts about the episodes in general, and then we'll be able to see that and post it, and we'll be able to interact with one another. Also, if you are part of Apple Podcast users, you have to actually go to Spotify app or its website to engage with our community there on Spotify. So just so you know, make sure you share if you care this episode with friends and family. We welcome your interactions on social media. Until next time, friends, this is Murder in the Black.
I didn't do my vibe, but it's okay.